Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights. In this next conversation, you're about to hear, I'm going to be talking with a special guest, LB and Bob Homer, about 15-minute cities and digital currency. We all know about digital currency because of blockchains, and when we talk about blockchains, of course, we are talking about Bitcoin and other types of public currencies that are decentralized and open to the public to mine and gather, so that they can gather wealth without it being part of a centralized bank. The digital currencies that we're going to be talking about today are going to be issued by government, and put through centralized banks, like the Canadian dollar, or as it's called, the loonie. If it becomes digital, what types of controls, personal controls, are we going to have to give up? And how far are we going to allow the government into our finances and into our lives with a digital currency? And we're going to also talk about a global news report that also spoke about this, where they reference the positivity of the experiment, or should I say the full-on use of digital currency in China, and how their social media is actually controlling the people so that they cannot travel past what is considered to be their 15-minute city. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot to listen to. So we're going to bring LB and Bob Homer onto the show in a second, so we can hear what they have to say, because if you know Bob Homer, he has his own podcast, Conspiracy and Science, where they talked about 15-minute cities. And LB is a great advocate for human rights, and for people to find those rights outside of what our corporations tend to want us to have. So let's welcome them to the show now. I'm going to welcome both LB and Bob Homer to the show. Bob Homer, as you know, he is the host of Conspiracy and Science. And Bob, starting with you, you actually did an episode on 15-minute cities, right?
We did. Earlier this year, we talked about, I'm the science, or I'm the conspiracy part of the discussion, and Jennifer's the science. So I talked about all the possible negative implications of it, and Jen talked about possibly some positives. But I think where we ended up was that there's a lot of there's a lot of concern around making something like this a reality.
Yeah.
Because on paper it looks good, but otherwise, when you really dive into it, there's some serious issues surrounding it.
Yeah. Okay. Introducing LB. Of course, you're my resident temperament to my human rights activist stuff, and you're a huge advocate for human rights, especially with different things with corporations and stuff like that. So trying to keep our society on track with these things and equality, right? So. Well, and you were actually the one who emailed me the information about 15-minute cities and how it is being approved across Canada, right?
Yeah, I had come across some information that suggested that in several cities it was being approved. In some cities more publicly, where citizens had the opportunity to chime in and offer their opinion, and in other cities where it was simply being announced that it was in the works without a lot of public conversation.
Yeah. So, from a human rights perspective, just forcing something like that, what are some of the positives and some of the negatives for human rights with the 15-minute city?
Well, as it's already been alluded, it's quite a complex topic, and I think the biggest thing is that there's not really the ability to have really good conversations about where this could all lead without the governments and the municipalities actually coming out with solid plans and really letting us know what's going to be happening, right? So there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of conjecture, there's a lot of like, where is this thing going to lead? Where is that going to go? And so if you look at where it can lead and where it could go and what it could be used for, I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned. But how it's being presented, I would say at this moment, without a lot of detail, as this very sort of, climate friendly, easeful thing, like a European village, I mean, who doesn't love that? My family comes from Europe. I've spent a lot of time there. I mean, it's wonderful, right? To have everything central and be able to walk to it. It sounds really nice. In how it's being packaged, but we're not really getting the details. We're not really being told how far it will go. We're not being told where it will stop, what our boundaries will be, what will happen to people that aren't affected positively by it. And I think that's probably the most concerning part of this, is that there's a real lack of detailed plans being released to the public. So we really don't know.
Right. Okay, so along with that, I'm gonna throw this out there. That there are now, I received another email from someone in Alberta about the introduction of the digital loonie, where we all know about blockchains and Bitcoin, where it's decentralized, which allows freedom of opinion and freedom of usage of it, because it's decentralized and it's not attached to a central bank or a corporation or government. But in this particular case, the digital loonie or digital currencies being issued by a government, it will be through a centralized bank. And what happens when we put those two things together? And it's already in this one global news report, they were already talking about how China's experimenting with it and how they're getting great positive results. I was like, so both of you are aware of how China does their social media and the downside to that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we think?
I think it's a slippery slope to introduce a non-decentralized currency, because with cryptocurrency, like you said, it is decentralized, and it's anonymous. What they're proposing is that that the government will have access and control over what you spend your money on and how you spend your money. And I think that's a slippery slope of where that could lead to.
Yeah.
It's definitely being suggested that it could be used as a control measure to make sure that you don't purchase too much of a certain thing or purchase things that are not good for the environment, things like this. And again, it's like, who's making those decisions? Where does it stop? Where do rights come into play versus what is potentially being done without a lot of discussion?
Yeah. Well, my opinion on this is where does democracy actually come into if the government's handing it over to us? What happened to democracy? Well, are we supposed to decide as a group and vote on things? So
In theory.
yeah.
Yeah, I would say in theory more than in reality these days. There seems to be a lot of legislation and decisions being made without a lot of public input, which is concerning.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been happening for a while. I mean, we can be pretty straight up about this. I mean, not everyone's noticed it happening for a while. I have, because I have a background that was somewhat tied into the medical industry and the school systems, and I saw legislation slowly being put through that was really strange. It was strange. There wasn't a lot of intention behind it. It was being put through without a lot of public conversation. And then it actually wasn't being used right off the bat. And it was like, well, what is this being put in for?
Yeah.
You know, and then you start progressively moving forward and you start seeing them tie things into this legislation that was just kind of quietly put under. And then you start seeing how they have been shaping future policies quite far in advance. And you start to see the slippery slope. You start to see where it's like, what aren't they telling us? And what do we need to have in terms of conversations? And, you know, and when is government maybe getting a little bit too much power and control?
Yeah. You know, for me, the first time I noticed that something was going wrong was the cable industry. When television was going from being, you need the rabbit ears to pick up the news, to this whole subscription base, you have to call Shaw or Telus and have them plug a cable into your house in order for you to get television. And when it went up for a vote in some areas, because it didn't always go up for a vote in all areas, when it went up for a vote in some areas, that there was misinformation attached to the vote, that a vote yes was actually the vote no. They twisted the words around so that it confused people, and that was one of the things that I've noticed, that in a lot of votes, how they're setting things up, they're introducing confusion and misinformation to control things also.
Yeah, it's definitely all within the message and how they word things, because a specific phrase could sway somebody one way or the other when they don't fully understand what they're voting on or for.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, and well, the example I'm bringing up was probably before the year 2000, and we're up to 2023, and now all of a sudden we're looking at, they're trying to introduce a centralized currency. And oh well, we had Tip McKenzie talking about how it's positive because, oh, with COVID, imagine that we would have been able to, as a government, been able to beef up your bank account. But at the same time, if they can beef up our bank account at the same time, can't they take the money back out again because we said something they didn't like? So.
Yep.
Yeah.
They've also put legislation through that they can pull money out of our bank accounts if our systems start failing. Those were put through a few years ago, very quietly as well. There's a lot of implications there, and just hackability, things like that. security. Those are also implications.
Because how many times have we heard about data breaches with health records, and you apply that same sort of sense of security to our financial system, and it's really unsafe.
Yeah, I got a survey from the Bank of Canada asking about the currency, and they did ask about the security, and my response was, it's just a matter of time until somebody figures out how to hack it. I mean, and particularly with AI, things like this, like we're advancing very quickly from a technological standpoint, and it's just really a matter of time until something's hackable, not really, I mean, there's nothing more to it than that. Like, someone's going to figure it out. And then what do we do if we're all tied into that?
Exactly.
Right. Let's face it. That the federal government especially does not have a very good track record with cybersecurity.
And especially with the Arrive app or ArriveCan or whatever that app was for travel that they introduced. It was supposed to be like a $6 billion or $1 million project or something like that, and then it escalated to like hundreds of millions of dollars for really no reason. And so they had no idea what they're doing. So how can we trust them to know what they're doing with our money?
Well, it's true, and then we find out that they were, also selling our information.
Yeah. It was.
But don't worry, when they do a currency, they won't do that.
No, of course
we don't need to worry. It's like having a really bad, friend or lover or business partner, and they keep doing wrong by you. You're like, they won't do it again. They'll do it differently this time, right?
Yeah. They figured it out now.
Well, on that issue, like, what is it with transparency and ethics? I mean, do our political figures have transparency or ethics? It's like, oh, don't worry, we wouldn't never lie to you.
Yeah.
Time and time again. Yeah.
Yep. It's kind of like that ongoing abusive long-term relationship. They've changed this, I mean, there are people in politics that do have ethics. I do think so. But, you can see them really not being able to do their jobs well. And you can see them at this point, where we are in our current climate, you can actually see them being berated. You can see, looking at Parliament right now, a lot of the time to me just looks like a schoolyard, situation where there's bullying tactics. There's, just mocking people. There's just ignoring people, just, sort of laughing at them versus answering them. It's so unprofessional, and there are politicians in that room attempting to bring up important topics and attempting to have important conversations. And yet there seems to be a political climate here in Canada where being professional is just not a thing. It's just not required. And I find that also very concerning. Why aren't we holding our politicians to a higher standard when it comes to having intelligent conversations, actually answering each other's questions? There's topics that are just being completely avoided as well, and it's quite obvious.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond party stripes too. Everybody's been accused of it and been a part of it. So it's not just one party versus another, or one province, or federally, provincially. Even local city councils suffer from the same thing. They have these agendas, and it's not always apparent of what it is right then and there. But as time goes on, you get to see the bigger picture.
Well, I'm actually living in a city that's dead center of that one. It's like, policing. Oh no, you don't get a chance to say how you feel about having. Should we have the RCMP or shouldn't we have the RCMP? Well, it never was asked of the public. We were just told, oh, we're getting rid of the RCMP. You know, so again, where happened to democracy is, you know.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not necessarily that it's a bad idea. It's just that we're not informed and we're not told about it. It's kind of pushed down our throats, and that particular agenda is moved along, and it's been being manipulated.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's been things that have gone on in my local city council where even when I've tried to bring it up and ask if there's going to be a conversation on it, is there going to be, a time where, we could, can we send a letter? Can we speak up? Can we voice some concerns? Is there going to be a conversation on this? It's interesting because I've ended up seeing where they've actually pulled it right out of the city's purview, and they've actually started putting it into other parts of government. And in the case I know of a topic that I kind of followed, I won't go into the specifics, but it actually got me all the way up to the top of the provincial. It got me this weird. I got to, basically forwarded all the way up there. It took months to get there, and then no one would answer me. Like they were just like, we're not going to talk to you about this. So it went from like the city telling me that it was actually like a city buildings under their authority, and then it just kept getting pawned off. And it was interesting because I do have a few friends that are reporters, and there was like, no way, Leanne, like that's not at all, like that's a city thing. And I'm like, no, it's not. And then they followed the breadcrumbs and got the Freedom of Information's done on it. And sure enough, it's not, but cities were paying for these things, even though they weren't city decisions, which is interesting. And again, I'm wondering what happened with that, because traditionally, not many people realize this, but in Canada, our municipalities actually hold a lot of power. They actually have a lot of authority to regulate what goes on within them. And it seems like somewhere along the lines that's kind of gotten distorted, which is, again, also kind of an interesting thing to consider.
Well, there was an issue around a hospital in one municipality. It's an older hospital, and it's being closed and being replaced. The replacement of the hospital is being moved from an area where there's where it's impoverished, and it's being moved to a more upscale neighborhood. And when I asked the mayor about it, he said it's completely out of my hands. He's like, I wish I could keep these medical services where they are, and not move them, but it was completely yanked out of his hands, and then moved and decided on a provincial level, and then handed back to him. So, I mean, and shouldn't the municipality have the ability to say, hey, but this is the group here, they need services, and this group over here is already covered? Shouldn't the mayor of the city or the city council be able to determine that?
You would think so. But again, it goes back to the overarching agendas that people with more power are kind of imposing on the municipalities and everybody underneath them.
Yeah. Somebody said to me today about, and I don't know how far off topic this actually goes, but somebody said to me today that there's a shadow government that has a corporate agenda.
Yes. How much do you want me to get into that today?
Well, go ahead, go for it, Bob.
Oh, he's preparing us as he has his drink.
Okay, here comes the warm up.
No, it probably the shadow government probably falls out of partly out of the 15-minute city and digital currency, because it does stretch far beyond, and it's far more far-reaching than anything. But yeah, there's groups of people who are in government, who are not in government, but are members of corporations that definitely have an influence on policy, not just in Canada, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. Some people call them like I don't know how far I want to go with this, but like because you have like people like the Carlyle Group and Bilderberg, those types of organizations where these rich and powerful people meet and have week-long meetings once a year, and probably throughout the year, but they have a very public display once a year, and they talk, supposedly what they talk about is setting the agendas for what's to come.
So what's to come is just determined by a group of billionaires, so to speak, and not by our actual elected officials or even some of the appointed global officials that we see, like in the UN, the WHO, or any of those sort of groups.
Those are all kind of underneath these other groups. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff. Yeah, I actually grew up around a lot of politics. It's an interesting setup, but when I was young, I was like, I was going to be a politician because I went through my social studies classes and I saw all of this stuff, and I was like, wow, like this country is built ineffectively. And so I went and I talked to some of these people in politics. And one person was like, please promise me you'll never get into politics. And, I was like, well, what do you mean? Like, there's all these, checks and safeties and balances. And they said, no, you have to sell your soul to get as far as they did in politics, which was quite far. And they're like, things are not what they seem. Things are not always recorded. Conversations happen all over the place. And it's tied into big business huge. And I ironically then had a career at another point in my life, a little bit later, because I was just a kid back then, but I had a career later where I did work with some very, very, very large international corporations. And I started to see what this person was talking about. It was just very interesting seeing the connection between government policies, what companies wanted, what they didn't want seen, where there was maybe stir-ups with other governments, like potential wars, things like that occurring. You start to see how like tied in everything is, and I'm sure I had like the teeniest little viewpoint of that, versus what, like, there's no way that was the whole thing, right? And so it's like, if what I saw is invasive as it was, there's definitely more there for people to be concerned about, like to be asking real questions about, because that means that democracy is not really what it says it is. How often are we just simply being sold ideas versus legitimately agreeing with what's going on and actually knowing what one thing is going to lead to or the next.
Yeah. So, okay, we've talked about a lot about the bad news part. What is it that, in you guys' opinion, what is it that we can actually do to push back?
What can we do to push back?
Yeah.
We all have to ask questions and not accept what we're told, and keep asking those questions, and not just questions, asking those tough questions. Like even down to, I'll give this quick example. Maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I went to Las Vegas for a photography convention, and going across the through the TSA security, and I was questioning why I had to take off my belt and my shoes, and just by saying why do we have to do it this way, I was surrounded in moments by other TSA agents and escorted to a secondary room to be patted down and everything. And just by asking questions like that, it stirs up. You're questioning someone's authority, and they don't like that. All the way down to the TSA agents, and all the way up the chain to who's ever on top. But so by asking these questions and not blindly obeying, I think that's one of the ways that we're going to have to like push back, and not in a confrontational way. I wasn't being confrontational, because that won't get us anywhere, and that just gets negative publicity, and we get demonized and whatever. But by being calm, rational, and asking questions of our politicians,
Right.
and making businesses accountable too, like through like social media or big business. What are their practices? What are they doing to make it their business better?
Right. I like that, asking questions. You're reminding me of course, the scientific method, right? You keep asking questions because till one day we might actually find the ultimate answer.
Yeah, because there's been so many occasions that when we're told one thing, and then years later it's come out through freedom of information or whistleblowers or whatever, that the official story that we got was completely false.
Yeah.
But nobody was asking questions. They were just told that this was the way, and went with it. But just because it's that way doesn't mean that's the correct way or the right way or how it should be done.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good lead into just to, like, in terms of how we have conversations and how we participate in society. There is a really large culture there's a culture that's arising among people that says, like, we can't question things anymore, right? And that's dangerous, because we do need to question things. We do need to use our brains. We do need to think about things. We do need to be able to make decisions for ourselves and our families that work. And we want to be able to stand by our decisions. And yet there is this growing culture of, like, it's not right to ask questions. It's not okay. Like, to ask that question is invasive, or that's violent, or you must be stupid to ask that question. I mean, it's so fascinating, because you go back, in time, it's like, oh, there's no stupid question, ask questions. Like, we used to have a culture that encouraged debate, that encouraged questioning, that encouraged having calm, rational conversations from two different viewpoints. And now there's this culture of really shutting down viewpoints that are different than your own, or shutting down questions you can't answer, or shutting down conversations that are maybe uncomfortable. And that does not breed good relationships, good policies. It doesn't breed good relationships, like one-to-one, or on a larger scale, like with our governments. It just creates this sort of vulnerability to, this is what we're all going to do, and we're just all going to go with it. No one's going to question it. No one's going to discuss it. And then the problem is sometimes those ideas are not good. Sometimes they're terrible. We needed to have a discussion on it. Sometimes there is something else going on, but no one's getting to the bottom of it because nobody's asking. So, like, even in your households, to have a culture where questions can be asked, where your children, and your other family members can have, reasonable debates with each other on different topics, where we're not pushing our ideas and our beliefs on other people and then expecting them to go with it. If you even just create that in your home, right, and that's going to start to break out past your home, and we can actually have these conversations with our neighbors and other people, and then maybe city council, and maybe our schools, and maybe our government, and things like that, because that questioning thing that you are talking about is so important. Yet we are systematically building a culture where asking questions has now become an act of violence, or to have a conversation with someone that is contrary to what they believe is considered violent. And I don't know about you guys, but when I do history studies, when cultures start to go that way, that's usually a fairly bad sign. Like, usually nothing good comes after that. So, that is really important for us all to be doing, and not to just blindly going with things and blindly accepting narratives and ideas that are not our own.
Right.
Yeah, it's the whole you're either with us or against us. So if you don't see, nothing's black and white, and they're trying to make it out to be black and white.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, if you don't fully believe it, then you must be against us.
Yes, like very nuanced conversations. Are being made very black and white. I'm like, look, hold on. There's like there's all of these other things and facts missing out of this conversation, but you can't bring them up.
No.
It's like, no, that's not what it's about. It's like this or this, and it's like, that's not true. And if you actually look at societies that go into a very totalitarian type state, there are key things that happen prior to that, and one of them is this formation of extremes, where the society itself and the government and all of that starts rallying in two different extremes. And then because of these extreme views on both sides, which I see in Canada right now, the moderate middle becomes scared of speaking up. The moderate middle, which is like 95% of people, becomes scared to ask questions, to say anything. And yet if they did, it would lead the whole society in a more moderate path. Yet because there's these two extremes, everyone kind of gets silenced. And then, weirdly enough, these two extremes usually end up offering the same solutions at the end of the day. Like, one is not actually better than the other. They're both quite rigid and, not the best for the larger population.
Right.
Yeah. Problem, reaction, solution. They introduce the problem, then the solution. Yeah. They create the reaction and have the solution for the problem that they initially created, which is on the extreme end of the spectrum.
We saw that in the pandemic, right? A lot of the public missed this. And in the end, we're seeing this extreme inflation where our grocery bills are through the roof, and to fuel up our cars is like ultimately ridiculous. But what was missed by the public was at the beginning of the pandemic, when Justin Trudeau decided, I'm going to create the CERB, he had to print almost $1 trillion. So he flooded our economy, the Canadian economy, with what was close to $1 trillion to be able to pay for the distribution of the CERB money. Well, what happens when the government decides to print a whole bunch of money? That inflation usually follows a year or two later.
Yes, it's economics. Yes. Yes, apparently no one has that good sense. But don't worry, they can print off some more money now that costs have gone up, and they can give you some basic living income so that they can flood it with more money so that everything can cost even more and you can't afford that either. But don't worry, then they'll have some more money.
Right, but then there's the digital currency. We'll solve the problem with the digital currency. So don't worry.
Exactly.
Because we've already been printing money anyways, so we might as well digitally print it. Like this is like it's it's interesting, and then it's like, well, you can't afford anything, so then yes, like a 15-minute city would be beautiful because you don't need a car. Now you don't have to afford your car. You can walk to work. Yeah, exactly. You don't have to go anywhere. Exactly, and it'll be nice to the environment. But then what if you do want to go somewhere?
See, that's where we're leading into this particular conversation as it hits social media, and the Chinese model is, as this conversation would hit social media, that all three of our bank accounts would be locked up. Go where? Right?
More than just your bank account. Literally, you would not be able to go get a train ticket. Like they can fully lock you up. Like they can restrict you from just about all of your services simply because you've been a bad citizen.
Yeah.
According to what has been determined to be good or bad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's dangerous, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I grew up and I learned how to be a functional, responsible adult, and I don't need the government doing my parenting for me, and I don't need them doing it for my children either, or my grandchildren. And that's not why, my ancestors that came, fled from, communist countries to give my family a life here. That's not why they came. They didn't come here to have more of that.
Well, yeah. Well, we'll get into the topic of ancestors because my ancestors are indigenous. Oh, wait. Colonialism, there's another topic. We're going to leave that topic alone for right now, though.
Thankfully, mine came more recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there's lots of implications with this, right? Like if you do have 15-minute cities and we do have a digital currency, and those two things are tied into each other, how quickly could you potentially not be able to access your money if you screw up? We do already know that a lot of the groundwork for watching us on social media has already been laid. That's factual. There's no conspiracy about that. It's there. It's built into the social media platforms. They could probably already give us a rating. So it's not like, the conversations around 15 minutes, there's not actually a lot of conspiracy talk, I would say, even really going on. There's a lot of actual factual things happening all over the world with it that could very easily affect the freedoms that we have and the rights that we have and our ability to move and our ability to have a business. And even trying to have conversations with local governments about that. I'm involved with businesses, and we are attempting to have conversations with municipalities about how we would, if these cities are put in, how does that affect us as businesses? How do we move from city to city doing our job, having our employees move from city to city? Would they be penalized? Would we have the same amount of passes? Would we have more passes? Are they not going to restrict movement at all? In which case, that's kind of interesting. It's not generally where these conversations are leading right now, but, if that's factually not going to happen, then we'd like to know that too. Like, how is that going to affect people's businesses? How is it going to affect where they work? Like, if you have to work within 15 minutes of where you live and you don't work remotely, does that mean you need to get a new job? And then what if it's not the same money? Who handles the extra money for you? Is that where this basic income conversation is coming in? Then will you be told that you can just work any job within 15 minutes and you can make basic income? Like, there's so many pieces to this that aren't being discussed.
Well, there's a good question. Is basic income going to pay for us to maintain the type of middle class life that we actually have right now, or is there going to be a downgrade?
Well, where's the money going to come from to pay everybody that basic income? Are they going to print more money, which is going to skyrocket everything, and the cycle continues?
Yeah, exactly. And then what happens? Then do we end up like countries where then your choices are now limited because that's all, people can afford? We don't really have a market for these other things now. We don't have businesses that are bringing in new and innovative products because they've also been restricted by whatever policies are in place and costs and all of that. I know a lot of business owners. A lot of business owners that I know have left Canada. They're not here anymore. They're like, where the decisions that are being made here do not seem beneficial for their businesses. I don't blame them.
Yeah.
And that's another good point. And when I did the episode on my show, we talked about this a fair bit. Was if you have the 15-minute cities, what types of businesses are going to be allowed to come in? Like, are they going to be? They're going to be the Costco's and the big box stores, and the little mom and pop shops are going to be pushed out because one, they're not going to be able to afford the rent. They're not going to have the foot traffic. So there's just going to be big box stores, and each zone, is there going to be like a Costco in every zone, or like or like for restaurants, or are they going to be like fast food, McDonald's, or what happens? They have like a Subway in one zone, but then you want to go to like an Italian restaurant 2 zones over. How is that going to work when they're setting limits, like in Oxford, England, when you can only go 100 free trips, or they're going to start fining you £70 per extra trip? Like, I don't understand how that's going to be beneficial.
Yeah, and then do the rich people get to like move around more than the poor people? Like how about that? How are rural people? How are they going to do that? I mean, look, some rural communities need to like come into cities for their medical care, for like all of that kind of stuff. How are those businesses in rural cities going to get their supplies? How are they going to be doing business? Are we just going to be squeezing out rural cities, like rural towns, rural people? And then how does that work into our class system? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, because they can't have a hospital in every little zone. Every 15 minutes, a hospital that has state-of-the-art equipment and doctors. It's just not possible.
Exactly.
So you're going to have to call an ambulance to take you 3 zones over. That's going to cost you. So you're not going to, people on lower income, they're not going to be able to afford to do that. So, like you said, it's going to create like a whole separate class, and it's going to divide us even further.
Yeah, like what if you have like, a family member that's in the hospital, or, needs to be somewhere else for medical attention or something like that, like a child, are you going to give you an apartment in that zone? And then if we start going there, then that just opens up a whole nother can of worms. Where are we going to give people apartments from if we need to start doing that so that they can live in a zone temporarily? Where's that coming from? Who's going to own that? What is the system that's going to be behind that? It seems like to really implement 15-minute cities, you would need to implement a lot of other systems and policies and structures that aren't currently in place. And I'm just really unsure why these aren't being discussed. I mean, these seem like things that we'd really have to think through before implementation, and yet cities are already implementing this stuff.
Yeah. Well, you're bringing up some interesting points on housing, though, and the term affordable housing is very vague, and if we look closely from when we were growing up to our children, the possibility of home ownership has shrunk. It has shrunk tremendously. They're with the whole 15-minute city thing. Are they going to push out the idea of home ownership and that somebody else owns the land and you're just renting?
And I think even the types of homes that they're building they're pushing a certain type of home, because but we're going to be in the market in about another year and a half. But anything that's in our price range is going to be a small condo, 3 bedrooms. When we don't want a small condo and 3 bedrooms, we want something slightly bigger. But they're not making like those types of houses that like where we are now anymore, because they're trying to stack as many people and create. And I'm seeing more and more of the retail below, residential above. They may not be doing a 15-minute city, but they are. They're already starting to create it with forcing developers to put retail underneath and smaller junior 3-bedroom condos up above, with tiny balconies and no yard, and making it more a communal living space.
Yeah.
Down below, and not everybody wants that, but that's all that the new developments that's being built. Through the vast majority of new development, that's what's being built.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even actually healthy living for some people. Some people, and we know this, are very sensitive to Wi-Fi, routers, things like that. And if you're that kind of person and you're living in a like densely compacted apartment building, there are actual health problems that you're going to have living that close to that many routers, that, you know, many signals that are just on all day. So it's not even actually reasonable living conditions for some people, even if you could do it and you did like it. You know, from every other standpoint, right? So again, there's another nuanced conversation. We aren't all built the same. We're not all built to live the same. We're not all built to be eating the same things. And, you know, it is a little concerning when you start looking at 15-minute cities that there would be some sort of way that we would all need to be living in order to adapt to that. And would that actually be reasonable to be asking everyone to do?
Yeah.
Right, and that's a good point, because they're trying to make this cookie cutter solution that's going to work everywhere, regardless of climate, of geography, population. This 15-minute city, this is the way, but it's not. There's so, like we've talked about, there's so many nuances and gray areas in the conversation that it's not going to work the way that it's not going to work the same in every single area around the world. It has to be adapted to the region, to the area, to the population that's there, and find solutions for those individual areas, not just some cookie cutter. It works here, so it's got to work over in Australia.
Yeah. And then if you don't fit, do you get special privileges? And then how do we determine special privileges? You know, who's doing that? Who gets to leave for special privileged reasons, or, you know, bring in different foods for special privileged reasons? I mean, I find it fascinating that we're talking about 15-minute cities for like climate change, but we still fly our food halfway over the planet. You know, food that could be grown here if we actually supported better agricultural practices and actually gave people, you know, the ability to go run farms in a really smart way. Farms that have mixed, you know, that are mixed. They're not just, you know, cattle. They're not just vegetables. They're not just, you know, because there's a lot of implications with that. Really, farming needs to be mixed. We need to be doing all these different things on the same land so that it can be revitalized and renourished and actually be used smartly. But we're not doing that. Like that, this system kind of systematically pushes those options away too. So are we going to start flying in? We're going to be like saving ourselves with like carbon climate change stuff in our 15-minute city, but we're going to be flying more stuff in, or I know, it's so weird. And then I heard, where did I hear the other day? It was some newscasters talking about like starting to fill out an application to fly places too, because like that's bad as well. And then would we need to start asking for permission to go on vacations and business trips, and we would be like applying, and you know, this, they made this sound very exciting. You because you get to apply to
Right.
travel. And I don't know, it didn't sound super exciting to me. I'm like, who decides then if your trip to go see your dying relative is okay, or your trip for business is okay? And if we are doing 15-minute cities, then will trips for business be okay at all outside of even our drivable zones? Like, how far does this reach out, and how far does it restrict us? And then again, do some people get special privileges? Like, if you guys are really good speakers, will you get like a special card that lets you travel around and speak? Or
Yeah. Well, you see this whole application to travel thing. You bring up a good point when you talk about the mass media person standing in front of a camera, or sitting in front of a camera, as it were.
they were sitting.
It's like, how exciting is this that you get to apply for? It's like, but they're building up a wall of propaganda that people were like, oh, see, he made it sound exciting, and it's okay. I'm going to drop the first F-bomb in this whole conversation. It's a mind fuck.
Well, just look at the Nexus cards. The conditioning for this type of applying to travel, the Nexus card makes you travel between Canada and the U.S. Super fast. You don't have to wait in line. You just have to apply for it and go through security checks and pay a fee for this extra privilege. So for years, since the introduction of it, it's just another way of conditioning us slowly over time, introducing bit by bit. Like, this whole thing reminds me of like a pointillism painting. When you're looking at it really up close, it's just a bunch of little random dots and you can't see it, but then when you step back, you see the whole picture. And that's kind of like what they're doing here with us, is that they're giving us they're making us stand 2 inches away from the painting, and here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot. It's all good, because these are nice colors and whatever, but they don't want you to step back and see the big picture.
Yeah.
They don't want to see what you're doing.
Yeah.
What they're doing.
Yeah. On the step back part, and there's legislation in Ottawa that it wraps around that idea of social media, that and this bill was actually created during COVID because there was people out there saying, well, questioning what it was that we were doing during the COVID pandemic, and now that we're past it, past the pandemic, but this bill would actually more or less make it illegal for you to say anything outside of what the mass media is talking about. That if you make a post, that it can be yanked down and maybe you can be fined. However they determined with digital currency, however they determined that fine would look like. Maybe you lose social media points or something. But this bill is sitting there and just waiting for the right vote to happen so that it can be passed through. And people are thinking that it's aimed solely at those people who want to cause controversy, but the controversy is really what the bill actually says and how it can affect anyone and take your ability to speak up away from you.
Yeah, I mean, people often agree with these things when they agree with wherever the government is saying at the moment, or the media. Mm-hmm. But I mean, as soon as you flip it around and they believe something that, goes against that, it tends to change. And we've seen this in previous civilizations and previous societies, right? It's all fine and dandy when you feel like you're on the right side of it, to be penalizing other people for speaking up and having different opinions. But, when it turns and it becomes your turn to be quieted or to be told to do something that you don't agree with, or to have your family subjected to something that you don't believe in, then it's like, oh, well, yikes. But it's too late. So,
Right.
So,
yeah. Anyway, because we can keep going with this, but we do have a time limit. So, why don't we get to final thoughts? And LB, final thoughts on 15-minute cities and combined with digital currency.
Separately or combined, I think there needs to be a lot more public, open discussion about it. There's a lot more questions that need to be asked. There's a lot of answers that need to be provided. We would need to set really appropriate limits and boundaries. As things are being rolled out now, I think it's a completely slippery slope. I don't think, people should be supporting just a haphazard sort of rollout. Why would we do that? I mean, that's not a good way to run your life. It's not a good way to run a business. It's not a good way to run a country or a city, right? People should really be looking for in-depth, well-thought-out answers on both of these things, and really be looking into as many aspects of these issues as they can, because as we've just touched on just a teeny weeny little bit today, there's so many parts of our society and our family life and our personal lives that these things would or could touch on and affect and change. So, I think that, these are topics that we really need to proceed with a lot of caution in terms of agreeing with, because there's so much that's just not really being fully discussed at this point in a public way, where we would know where things would lead and where they would stop and what the boundaries would be and how we would deal with all of these nuances that would arise from these two things.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Bob.
I totally agree. I think our leaders, our leaders should make decisions based on science and economics and public input, and not just have a knee-jerk reaction to whatever the hot topic is of the day, and create a policy that that's not well thought out and ultimately poorly implemented. And then
the hot science of the day, all the science.
All the science, not just what's trendy right now or what one study showed or whatever it is, on any number of topics there.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So, thanks, guys.
Thanks.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. And these are some really hot topic items, and we need to actually investigate as the general public and enforce our government officials to keep us in a real democracy where we can actually speak up. So I want to thank everybody again for listening. Please find that subscribe button wherever it may be on your computer screen or your phone, and keep listening to Policy and Rights as we come up with more updates about what is happening with government policy versus human rights. Thanks, guys. It was nice talking to you again. Thanks, LB, and thanks, Bob.
Thanks.
Thanks.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.